not free from certain things, expectations from our parents or whatever. And so you're supposed to do this thing and not that thing and da-da-da-da-da. And you can become so disconnected from your own nature that it becomes even more and more and more important that you find places and again, voluntarily, willingly participate in entering into the desert, so to speak, entering into the wilderness. And that's very much what artists do. They enter into the desert wilderness, find some things, see some things, express it to the rest of us.
This is Way of the Artist with Brandon Colby Cook and Evan Schulte.
Exploring the challenges of the creative call
so that you can claim your own path
and make your life a work of art.
Okay, so we got a podcast episode and we had a bunch of technical challenges getting this thing off the ground, getting it started. I actually already did an intro, but I erased it and I'm doing it again. So welcome to my second go around, everybody. Although it'll be the first for you. Second for me, second for us. Anyway, so
Great preamble.
Okay, we're kind of talking about aimlessly a little bit. We're talking about the desert and the metaphor and the symbolism of the desert and how this plays into, self-discovery and also creativity. And somehow by getting rid of everything that is kind of often available or sometimes a distraction, we are in this place of barrenness, but in barrenness, there can also be a kind of suffering that happens too. Mm-hmm. So I don't know how this is all going to play in. Anyway, that's the best I can do for presenting it because we don't really have a title, but we'll figure that out in time. And Evan, I'll throw it to you. What do you got?
Well, maybe the title is something like When the Path Leads to a Desert or something like that, because that's very much part of everything. Way of the artist. We talk very often about your path, finding your path and all of those things. And we very often use the image and the metaphor of like a mountain or something or a forest, but never really have we gotten into this really, really ancient metaphor of the desert. And in the initial start to this podcast, you talked about, like how the Doors went off into the desert and Burning Man, and even you thinking of something like Las Vegas, right? Was a place that was built in the desert. And why was it built in the desert? Well, because that was where they were free to have gambling. Mm. And so there's this whole thing with the desert as being a place of freedom. There's a freedom out there, but there's also a desolation out there too. And it's this place that people continue to go to the desert to seek, to find, to discover something, typically in like an internal thing. And there's this, it's sort of like an outward manifestation to go into the desert to reflect like an internal space that you're trying to find. And as you were mentioning, the desert is a place of there's nothing, there's next to nothing in the desert, almost nothing to be distracted by in any way whatsoever. And that can be a very challenging situation. It can be a very scary thing to do. Like I even think of, some years back when I did one of those 10-day silent meditation retreats, there was something very scary about that. And you could look at that in the sense of you're entering into a kind of desert. Where you have no interaction. You're just completely with yourself and your thoughts and your mind, and you're immersing yourself into that kind of experience where you really don't have much in the way of stimulation going on around you, and that starts to do something to you. And it can be hard, but there's also tremendous creative potential. In fact, could argue that the greatest creative potential exists in that space where there's kind of nothing.
Yeah, this idea of stimulation, I think, is an interesting thing to venture into, because when you get away from stimulation, like if you just put your phone down, for example, like a lot of times people put their phone down. I mean, I've noticed it with myself. It's like, what am I going to do? And, getting into that ability to just sit and be and not have some type of thing that's being input, or nothing, kind of just let yourself be and see what happens. And I think for people who don't feel like they're very creative, I would suggest that you need, metaphorically, somehow you need to create a desert for yourself. You need to get rid of the input and get rid of the stimulation that is continually bombarding you all the time, and get into a space of like literally not having anything other than yourself. And that's the first, I think, one of the first most important deserts we need to conquer, we need to explore. And we can flip out in that, like people can flip out in the silence of just being with themselves. And what will happen is, if you try this, and if you haven't tried it already, you'll probably find that thoughts will come up that you have been able to avoid, thoughts and feelings that you've been able to essentially just push to the side or push down or mask or cover, and all of a sudden you're like, well, I don't want to face this thought. I don't want to think about this. I don't want to feel that. And one thing that I've been working on, and we talked a bit about this before we even started recording, was something I essentially just came across this recently, and it suddenly made sense to me. Was that everything that I think I am, and everything about my story of how like I am the way I am today, and why I can do certain things or can't do certain things, or what my quote unquote wounds are, I had this epiphany that all of that was bullshit and none of that was real. And this was a very big shift, because once I realized that, and I'm sure there's some people who maybe don't agree with me yet, but listen, we justify our limitations by the perception and the essentially the way we see the world and ourselves and the past and all of that. And if you realize that you have put all of that together and made all of that up, you're the one that fit the pieces. And they fit so you think they work, but they don't actually go together. They just found a way to find a fit. And so, for example, just to kind of give context to this, when I was a kid, I wanted to be an architect at one point, and I was in this advanced drafting and design program. And I remember I went to coffee with my father, and I told him, I'm going to be an architect and blah, blah. And he said, and it was weird because he said to me, you're not going to be an engineer. And I remember that hurt, and I remember it hurt me deeply. And I remember about 15 minutes later, maybe 25 minutes later, we went down to the water, and we were by the water, and all of a sudden I broke down crying. And he's like, what's going on? And I was like, I just really hurt that you said I wouldn't be an engineer because I've been working so hard to do this. And he's like, he apologized. He's like, I didn't really mean, he's like, I didn't mean for it to come off that way. He's like, I just didn't see you that way or whatever, blah, blah, blah. But in that moment, it hurt me deeply. And, and then so for the rest of my life, I kind of carried along this idea of and whether I subconsciously or consciously, it was just kind of like, you're not an engineer, you're not going to be that. And ultimately, you know what, that wasn't the right fit, but it's still kind of a wound. The thing is that now I look at that story, if it has a play in my life today, it's only because I made it have a play. Because it's like, oh, my dad never thought I could do this, and so, and I never ended up doing it, so there's something true about that or whatever. That's not true. It's just that hurt me in that moment. And so I never became an engineer, maybe because of that, maybe not because of that, who knows. But the thing is the way I put that story together was made up. I concocted it. I perceived it. And so the desert is recognizing that you are not these things you put together. that they are not actually you. And then you go, well, who am I if I'm not that? And that can be a very frightening thing.
Yeah, you bring on an important aspect, I think, of this, because there is this stripping away.
Yeah.
Like that's really so much of what it's about. It's like, all right, we're going to strip away all of these things when we enter into the desert, right? And what are you left with?
Yes.
When it comes to, and what you're left with is just the truth of yourself or certain things, and that's all you have to go with. And that can be a very tough thing to do. It's not always a pleasant thing to face a truth. It can be very uncomfortable. And it's funny you're talking about just like being on your phone and saying, oh yeah, like how many times have I caught myself being on my phone like while the TV is on, like some show, and I do catch myself sometimes just being like, Evan, what the fuck are you doing? Like, are you on your phone or are you watching the show?
Yeah.
Pick one.
Yeah.
Like, just like, if you're going to be on a screen, just be on one of them.
Yeah.
And really just commit to it, to the one thing that you're doing. But yeah, like all of these distractions. And I think that's, it's one of those things that we have these events that we create for ourselves now, and they're very often big group things, but I think it's so important for us to willingly enter into that desert. I think another word for it that's often used is just the wilderness. Like, enter into the wilderness, like the place where you are stripped away of your comforts, your distractions, your all of these things, so you can reconnect to yourself, that you can reconnect to your place in sort of the cosmos, to on like sort of the grandest scale of things, because these are things that in our modern world we don't typically engage with as much, because it's so easy to just not leave your house.
Yeah. Well, that's true.
Like it's once upon a time it wasn't an option, for you to never leave your house for days at a time. You always had to be out, and there weren't as many things to just distract yourself with, and just basic levels of survival are so much more convenient now, right? Where to a large degree, we don't have to think about a lot of these things, but a lot of these things, and this is not me knocking, it's great that we can go to a grocery store and we can just buy things, and we don't have the thing of, if I don't hunt something or whatever, like I'm going hungry and my family's going hungry and we might die if this continues, like we don't live in that. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. But
there's our connection to nature, the natural world, which I think it's something that helps us to connect to ourselves. And I think that very often that wilderness and that desert, for many of us, when we enter into that space, we're thrown into it as opposed to willingly entering it. And I think that as human beings, but certainly if you look at the artist side of things, like you bringing up the Doors, right? And their somewhat infamous trek out into Joshua Tree, doing mushrooms and stuff like that, finding themselves and as a band and creatively, and you hear stories like that all the time. But it's something that you're actually willfully doing. You're not willing, but it's what's the word that I'm looking for? You're
consciously.
You're consciously. You're willingly. You're voluntarily.
Voluntarily, that's a good way.
Doing it, as opposed to
having it imposed on you.
Having it imposed upon you. Yeah. But there's something about, okay, I'm gonna go and I'm gonna do this thing and enter into this space because it's essential.
Yeah, that's I think that's a really interesting thing to look at with all of this, is that there are times in our lives where we may be pushed to face ourselves and face the metaphorical desert. And when it's thrust upon us that way, we kind of resent it because we think, oh, like, this isn't fair. Like, life's, I ended up here and I just want to get out of here. And all you're doing is like longing to get out of the desert. And, we are Way of the Artist. So we're talking about kind of the artist perspective on this, but the artist who's actually after some kind of truth or some type of creative, I want to say ingenuity or whatever that might be, they would do something that's counter to what most people would do, was they would actively go to the desert on purpose and remove all distraction. And, and what the artist teaches us is that they teach us that this desert is not as bad as it may seem. Because most of us, when we experience the desert of our lives, we complain and we whine and we bitch and we moan and all of this, right? I mean, like, if you read the Bible, just read the beginning of the Bible, read Exodus and read like Numbers and all of that stuff, right? And you'll begin to see like everybody was just suffering in the desert. But what were they leaving? This is the thing. Here's a little Bible study for everybody, whatever. But what they were leaving was slavery. And when they were complaining in the desert, they were like, oh man, we had it better in slavery. Let's go back to Egypt. Let's just be slaves again. Basically, they were whining about that. And it was like, your path to freedom from something that is not a good life might feel painful if you're reluctant in the period. And you talked about the desert being freedom in and of itself.
Yeah.
But people, as much as they want freedom, it's a scary prospect to have freedom when you haven't had freedom in your life.
Yeah.
And what I mean by this is, like, for people who were born with phones, right, and they were given them as young children, that became an anchor in your life. It actually became a real negative thing in your life, and you don't know it because it feels so good. But it's like you love your chain. It's like you love this anchor that's attached to you. And so one of the things that I think our next generations are going to have to figure out how to deal with, and I'm sure even people of our generation are figuring out how to deal with, is we have to learn to put our phone down. We have to learn to put it down, leave it at the house, go outside and do things in our day without it. Because it literally is an anchor, and it keeps us attached to something. And it's very hard to have us understand that that's not freedom, because we have access to the internet. We can get information at a whim, all of these great things. And yes, those are all true. And in certain ways, the phone does create freedom. But in certain ways, it's actually what enslaves you.
Yeah.
And also limits your creativity and stifles you, right? So, for the artists out there who are truly after that ingenuity and that kind of like finding themselves, put your phone down. like put your phone down sometimes. You really have to, for your own sake. And as you begin to part from it, you can begin to have a relationship with when I want to pick it up and when I want to put it down. Not just out of habit, like, oh, I don't feel good, I'm gonna pick up my phone. There's a lot of interesting motifs in all of this.
There's because just especially, the phone is an easy target for our day and age here, but it's so representative of, and you use the word enslaved, and I know a lot of people, they get their asshole gets all puckered up real tight, and it's like, it's not, you shouldn't use that word because historically, and it's like I do understand that, but at the same time, if we don't use strong words to actually describe real problems, I think we don't do them justice either. And saying it's like, oh, got an addiction, it's like, okay, but like, what if we thought about this as like enslavement? Like, you have like, it's a type of enslavement to this thing, and because it is, you're not free. And when we think of it in the context of thinking about what if you turned your phone off and put it away for the weekend? How many people just get real uncomfortable with that idea immediately? Like, let alone just, for me, sometimes I just go and I'll take a walk out in nature and I leave my phone at home, because there's a difference. Like, there's a visceral difference for me when I'm out in nature and I don't have my phone on me, and when I do have it on me. Like there's a completely different quality to my engagement with the environment around me, right? Because my phone could go off, or I could, check out what time is it, or whatever.
Sure,
like just these little things that you just like, it's like, well, I'm not really here anymore. But yeah, that whole, if there's something, just think about certain habits or things that you have in your life, like your phone or whatever it might be, and just try that on. Think about, it's like, what if you just put that away for a day? Just that thing. What if you just turned that off and put it away for a day? You weren't going to look at it or whatever it is. And if that makes you uncomfortable, right? And for some people that can be really uncomfortable, that means that you are not free. There's, and to a large degree, I mean, you're born into any society, culture, you are born into sets of expectations, cultural norms, things like that. These are all things that to a large degree very often they're imposed on us, right? And that often means we're not free from certain things, expectations from our parents or whatever. And so you're supposed to do this thing and not that thing, and da 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 da. And you can become so disconnected from your own nature that it becomes even more and more and more important that you find places and again, voluntarily, willingly participate in entering into the desert, so to speak, entering into the wilderness. And that's very much what artists do. They enter into the desert wilderness, find some things, see some things, express it to the rest of us. It's like going out, I saw something, let me share this with you.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's a big part of what the artist does. I mean, the artist can take information or experiences that they have outside of the norm, and sometimes they're not even going out and necessarily capturing new information out there that we haven't seen, but they're going out there and then looking back on us from a perspective. So like if you go to the desert and then you look back at everyone who's in the distraction of everything, you see it from a different perspective because you remove from all the distractions that are around everybody, and you can see everybody almost like you're looking into a looking glass or looking into a snow globe, and you can kind of see that world. And from there, this can be a really great way, I know as a storyteller, to be able to see what's going on for people and then go, oh, I see a story in here. And then you actually, like as a screenwriter, I suppose as a novelist it might be similar too, but then you go into some characters that are in that world, but you have that 1 foot outside the door as the artist kind of seeing the world they're in too. So you're able to kind of look at what they're going through and at the same time be in it with them. And that's like one of the most important parts about storytelling, right? So as an artist, like going out to the desert, like I would almost say it's necessary, because when you write stories from within the globe of this thing, and you don't see it from the outside, you're kind of caught in the trappings, and everyone's like, yeah, this is just all the same old shit. We see this all the time. It's all whatever. Yeah. There's nothing about it. But we look at those artists who they somehow craft something that kind of shows us, and it has enough where we can go, wow, I can see myself through this novel or see myself through this movie. One of my favorite movies, and I've mentioned this many times in the podcast, is Fight Club, which was a bit before its time. But I think with Chuck Palahniuk, who, he's an interesting writer in what he likes to be very provocative already. But one thing about him, which I think he was very good at, or has been very good at doing, particularly with that story, was he could see society from the outside. And when he created these characters, Jack and Tyler Durden and all of this, it was really a reflection of our own cultural societal challenge. And then he threw it into a movie and kind of, you know, gave it an interesting kind of spin and all of that. But what's so fascinating about that movie is the more you watch it, the more you see how there was like, he had one foot outside the door, and it's like, how did you know that? Obviously you broke away from the society for a moment, took a look at it, saw what we were living through, and then you went back in and then through these characters, you shared that story. And so the only way I could see it in a way was by you presenting it to me as though I was within it, but you at the same time had one foot out, and you could through that show me an outside view of it. And I mean, some people totally miss the point. They're like, it's a cool movie about fighting, you know. It's like, no, but kind of, but no, you know what I mean? But sometimes that's the thing, right? Is like there's an entertainment value to it, which is enough to entertain the person that's not going to look any deeper, but still fascinating enough so that the person who does feels really rewarded and, you know, like they benefited. And I feel like that's where that's where the great art lives, you know?
Yeah.
And there's one movie, Evan, you'd be able to speak on this better, but I think it was a Marvel movie or something where it was like Cold War or something. But I think they kind of did that in one of the Marvel movies where they kind of were able to almost have more meaning, or they stepped outside of the story a little bit. And it wasn't just your regular superhero action movie. It actually had some kind of almost comments on culture.
Well, yeah. I mean,
I don't know. Maybe it didn't live up to that degree, but
yeah. I mean, there's definitely every now and then, I think, because I've not so much anymore, but I had been a bit of a sucker for Marvel movies for a while, and I'm pretty disenchanted with everything that's going with that.
Here's my point, though, just before you carry on, is that every now and then a mainstream movie that seems very kind of almost plastic or bubblegum, popcorn, however you want to describe it, all of a sudden it just does something a little bit more, and you're like, oh, that was pretty fucking cool.
Yeah.
You know, because it was entertaining and it had all the razzle dazzle and the glitz and glam and all the things that a big movie does, but then it had some comment on society and culture, and you're like, wow, like I feel like I got a little more out of that than what I was expecting.
It made me think, it hit something sometimes a little bit unsettling.
Yeah.
Right. And that can, and a great story can do that. A great story, I think, is a little bit disruptive on some level, and it can be, you know, in the sense of like Fight Club, for example, which in many ways, like, that movie is just more relevant than ever.
It was more,
you know?
I would say it was more disruptive than entertaining when it came out, and that's why people had a difficult time receiving it.
Yeah.
But it was so accurate that later people were like, wow, this is a really ahead of its time story. But it was one of those stories that, like, on the surface, like, it did look very entertaining, like this fight club, underground fight clubs, and like, this looks fucking awesome. But then people saw it and they were like, what the hell did I just see? You know, it didn't quite have that popcorn feel that I think initially they thought when they were presenting it and marketing it would have. But it became a cult classic. I mean, it's one of the biggest cult classic movies ever.
Yeah.
But, you know, sometimes when you're an artist, you're actually so far ahead of your time or so far removed in your presentation that people can't catch up to it as quickly as... and Fight Club was a great example. Like, some critics hated it. Like, you should read the critic reviews. They're amazing. Like, some of them. Oh, yeah. And then to see how wrong those critics were now, you look at them and it's laughable about their review. And it just shows how blind those critics were. Yeah. Right? That's almost why Fight Club is so amazing, because it shows how blind we were all at the time, which is now so evident and clear. But at that time, no one saw it. And that's where I love how the artist shows you something. Yeah. And you're like, wait a minute, I'm not ready to see this yet. And I reject it. Like, that's kind of how we are. We don't always accept it. We just go, no, it's shit. I reject it. And it's like, and then time sometimes reveals that, no, you're just blind. That's why you rejected it.
Yeah. I remember I had like a special edition of that movie, and it contained like a little booklet. Yes. That they put like all the of these snippets of the negative reviews in it. That it's just how much critics hated the movie. And to a large degree, it was, I mean, I don't know, for whatever reason, I mean, there was something about, prophetic isn't necessarily the right word. I can't think of but it was almost, it was
agitating.
It was agitating, but it saw something, and it saw a direction of things that was both, it was relevant at the time, but it's now it really does seem more and more relevant today. Like it's interesting that you bring it up, because I haven't thought about Fight Club for a while, but I'm like, yeah, when I really think about some of the big themes or some of the big things that it was communicating, was essentially this loss of meaning, right? Like when I think of Edward Norton's character in there, like it was such a commentary on modern society and materialism and the void that's there. There was no sense of connection to the world, and isolation, like a lot of the things that we were talking about in terms of desert, right? Like where
he was thrust into the desert. It's interesting. I should never even thought about this, but he was thrust into the desert, but by trying to actually get away from it, he actually entered it, because that's like, I mean, I don't want to ruin the story, but he becomes self-destructive. Let's just put it that way. And in some ways, he's trying to pursue this thing of being complete and have these things and have everything he needs. And ultimately it leads to his own kind of like unhappiness and unfulfillment and depression, and, and he can't sleep and all of this stuff. Right. And it's interesting, because then now that I'm thinking about it, sometimes we need to get rid of everything so that we can actually see what we need. Because that's a lot of what that movie is about too. He gets rid of all his material things, and then basically they only take in what they need at that point.
Yeah.
And it has, I mean, look, the movie's not perfect in the sense that it's not the ideal way to live, because it's like, it's basically like going like, well, what if we just chose anarchy? But I do think there's a certain amount in this metaphor of the desert where you are almost destroying everything so that you can see what it would be like to be without it all, and then you would be free of it. Because there's a quote, and I love this quote in actually, I'm gonna give you two.
Sweet.
Okay, so there's one that I love
quotes.
I love this one, the stuff you own ends up owning you.
Yeah.
Okay, that's one of my favorite quotes.
I say that one a lot. Yeah.
Right? So Jack, who's Edward Norton's character, he is owned by his stuff. So freeing himself from that stuff, like literally we're talking about that slavery metaphor, he frees himself from that stuff, and no longer is he bound to his things anymore, which frees him to a whole new way of life and a whole new thing. Secondly, there's this quote, I fucking love this part, where Tyler Durden's talking to him in the bar, and he says, we're on the Titanic and it's going down, and Martha Stewart's polishing the brass, and it's like there's a certain amount
I don't remember that line. That's great.
So good. But the thing is like there's a certain amount of us, we're trying to polish the brass on something that is tanking. It's going down. It's on its final leg. It's ending, and we're trying to make it pretty, and we're trying to and it's like, if we could just accept that this is over and this is ending, and let it die, like let it go down, and discard it and go to the lifeboat and whatever, and just you wouldn't waste all your time and energy trying to perfect something that's not. And you can look for that metaphor in your life on a micro scale, and you can see it in society and culture on a macro scale. But it's such an interesting thing. Like, would you want to be polishing the brass on the Titanic as it was going down? And if you can see how you're doing that in your life right now, it could be very freeing, because you're like, shit, what am I wasting my time making this so important when it doesn't even fucking matter?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, but we do things almost by rote, because it's like, oh, that's what you're supposed to do. It's like, if you could just acknowledge the fact that this thing is going down and it's over, you could move on and you could be free. And you could go do something with yourself that would be so much better. But you're still caught. You're trying to save something that was dying, right? I mean, look, there's so many ways in which that metaphor has landed in my life. So I'm going to leave it with our audience. I'll leave it with you to think about how that is actually happening right now in your life. But I found it very freeing when I started to identify that shit. And seeing yourself, because there's these quotes in this movie where sometimes, upon the first viewing, you're like, haha, yeah, Martha Stewart polishing the brass. And then upon later viewings going, shit, how am I Martha Stewart polishing the brass?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, and that's freeing because you actually realize, oh shit, I'm caught in the same trap.
Yeah, I'm going to have to, I've seen Fight Club many times, but I might have to give it another watch again. It is one of those movies that, I come back to, especially in the sort of void of great films that seems to be the trend right now, and to go back to something like that. Because there's a lot of things going on here in that movie, and a lot that has to do with I think a lot that has to do with this conversation that we're having here. This and there's so many things going on in Fight Club. Like, there's also this anger, and a lot of people just think that it's like this glorified, like you said, glorified anarchy. And it's like, not really, because if you would only walk away with that if you forget how the movie ends. You know what I mean? Like, if you forget what goes on in the last, 20, 30 minutes of that movie, where something else happens, that flies in the face of that. It's just like, yes, just anarchy. Yeah. Right. But it's, there is an anger to it. And I think that was part of the whole, what was upsetting about that movie. And I think that there are movies like that come around every now and then. Like, I think of The Joker as well, more contemporary movie, which I thought was fantastic. There's something troubling about it. And to me, one of the most troubling things about The Joker was how much I connected to him and his character, how much I understood his anger and his madness. Like, there was something about that just, and that's unsettling. It's unsettling but he goes in a kind of a direction. And I think that that's one of these things. But when you enter into those spaces, is that it can go in a really bad direction, but it can also go into a really good direction, really positive direction. And there's sort of a choice, I guess, that to be made in that space. And because these are characters that have to free themselves one way or another, because they've been caught up in such a meaningless existence, where they've been trying to fit into something that's, like you said, it's broken. It's like, these are characters who have made that recognition, like you said, polishing the brass on the Titanic, right? And there's this recognition, and even though they might not be able to say it or totally understand it, there's this feeling that something isn't quite right. And when there's no space to go and put those things and those feelings, right, and to wrestle with them, feel them, really destructive things can happen, right? Really bad things can happen. I think that's that whole prophetic element, because you can look at a lot of in some ways, like I would say, like the men crisis that we have now, right? Which is, there's for a long time, when you look at how much crime is committed by men, how much suicide there is in men, how much violence there is in men, right? And Fight Club is very much about that. They are all going to this thing because at least they can feel something there, right? They have a place to put all of this shit, right? But it's not necessarily a good place like, but it was just the only place, right? And when you see a lot of these problems that are ongoing today, you know, men who have a hard time understanding where they fit, and it's not exclusively reserved to men, but it's there's something about just how Fight Club kind of saw that thing happening, escalating. It's like there's a problem here, and it goes really badly. You know, like there's like, because it really does say that it says this goes really badly if we don't find some other path through this. But this is where all of this shit ends up. You know, it gets really nasty. Yeah.
Well, you know, and there's endless things to pull from great art, because often I don't think the artist even knows, like they don't even know what they're doing when they're creating something. Like I
totally agree with that.
They don't know the levels at which they're communicating something, and they might be trying to communicate one thing and they don't realize that it carries several other great messages with it. And so, you know, I think as an artist, I think this is a good lesson for any artist, is to, you know, you go and authentically, genuinely try to do whatever it is you're trying to do with whatever your creation is. And then at the same time, like, let it, I don't know if this is the right term, but like, let it breathe and accept that there may be, if you can get one truth, that trust that there's several other truths that are following closely behind it that you're not even aware of. And then all of a sudden you'll see them later, and maybe not, maybe you won't, but maybe someone else will. And that's the beauty of doing something with an open, genuine, like, heart and intention. And I think, like, this, to go back to our motif of the desert, right? I think the reason why you go to the desert consciously, voluntarily, is that because you're looking to capture one truth. If you can get more than one, then that's wonderful. But if you can capture one truth, so I'd say, like, you know, for the artists out there, or the people that are pursuing a creative pursuit, you go to the desolated, you go to the place where you are alone, without distraction, without all this stuff, simply to find something that is true. You know, it's interesting because when we started the origins of this conversation, you were like, you know, there's something about truth in this conversation that I want to talk about. It's interesting how it ended up at the desert, and it always kind of leads back to the same nugget that we started from. But it seems like, to me, you go to the desert to find something true that is too distracting when you're around all the things in the world. And so there's a part of us that needs to go and be alone or be without, so that we can get perspective and just step outside of this kind of spinning, activated thing that has just captured our attention and distracted us constantly. You know, it's a moment to breathe.
There's like a push and a pull, right? Because you also then need to come back,
and then you come back with the intention,
and that's important too, because otherwise you're not connected with the rest of society. But then you have to go back out into the desert again. It's this thing. It's like you've got to continue to go out and to come back in, to go out and to come back in, right? It's not like a one or the other.
One or the other, and one or the other isn't better. And I think also something that just came up for me, and I've tried this myself. Don't run away to the desert. Don't be like, I'm running away and I'm never coming back. I hit a point in my life where it's like, fuck it, I'm just going off. And it's like, you know, it's there's that kind of story, is like you go on this great journey out to wherever you go, so that you can come back and see why you left and why it was so important. But you couldn't see the value of where you were until you left and went on the journey and went away. And you don't know. I think the other thing too is, if you get called out to the desert, or you have a calling out to your metaphorical desert, whatever that is for you, that you don't look at it as like, okay, well, I'm going to come back in X months or weeks or days or hours or whatever. You look at it as like, I'm going to go out there until I'm ready to come back. And I don't know how long that's going to be. I think that's an important part of the desert analogy, is that you don't put a timeline on it and say like, it can only be this long and I'm only doing it for this. Like you have to, and you're like, because you'll get to the desert. And one other thing, and we haven't talked about this, is you get to the desert and the desert is beautiful, but also scary at a certain point. And there is the fear that will sneak in, which is, when will this ever end? And that's an important fear to face and deal with and not know the answer to get over it and be like, it's okay if I don't know when this is going to end, because that is one of the trappings of our world and why we don't actually leave the comfort, because we're so scared that if we leave the comfort, we'll never get it back. And it's a very real fear we must face, but it's also one of courage and one of growing up and one of maturity, you know, and trust and faith and all these other words that we like to dance with.
Yeah.
Wrap it up?
Yeah, we got to wrap it up.
Yeah, we got to wrap it up. I know.
We got to wrap it up. We're time constrained.
We've done pretty good, though. We're
done pretty good.
We're pretty tight, you know, done well, I guess, proper
All
English,
right. Well, what's this beer that we're drinking, Brandon?
Oh, man. Oh, geez. Batch 44 is the brewery. Got a growler pour. Now, it's a Kolsch, and it's something like, I'm forgetting the name. I turned out my phone so I can't even look at it. It's like Not My Uncle's or something like that. Not My Uncle's Kolsch or something like that. Anyway, you can't miss it. But it's a newer beer they've have on brew, and I thought it was delicious when I had it at the brewery, and I was like, this is really good, and I thought it was really tasty. And you know what, I'm enjoying it now. So I don't know. What are your thoughts?
No, it's been really good. It definitely has that sort of European kind of vibe to it. Not skunkiness, but you know, it's got that thing. It's got that thing that I can't. I don't know what you call that. Someone out there knows. But I've been enjoying it. It's nice, light, and
cool. That's the thing. That's why I kind of like, it was light and it was kind of nice, but it also had a bit of flavor to it. So I don't know. Skunky feels like a
it's not. It is. It's not. But
I get what you mean. There's like it has a distinctness, but I like it. I don't know. It's not like a. But yeah, I get you. It's.
I just don't have a better word for it, but it's got like
you really threw it under the bus.
A certain kind of like pungence to it. That's still not even. That's still not
horrible,
even good.
Horrible. It's delicious.
It's
guys.
delicious. It is. I'm not. This
Get
is,
it.
None of this is a
chance.
criticism.
If you like Kolsch, I enjoyed it. That's my review. Not that we're paid to do that. We just do it because it's tradition. Okay, so wrapping this baby up.
This one up. Closing comments.
Okay, I'm going to give you my final thoughts.
All right,
leave it with you.
Do it.
Only because I started this conversation. So here's what I'm this has been fun. This has been a really enjoyable conversation for me, because it's reminded me why it's important for me to go off sometimes and just be and let myself be without, and to embrace kind of the unknown, and also embrace the part of being with myself in all of my shit, you know? Because when you're in the desert, or when I'm in the desert, I should say, I find a lot of metaphorically, because it's not always a desert, but metaphorically, my shit comes up. Like, oh, when will this ever end? You know, am I ever going to figure my life out? You know, I feel this way. I don't like this feeling, but I don't have anything to escape to right now. And to learn to be okay with that and sit in that and see that as natural and human and something that's just a part of this journey. And so I think one of the things that I've been really working on is freeing myself of any past stories or narrative or perceptions that I've had in my life. And I'm seeing why sometimes it's good to just go out there so that I can get some perspective on some of these stories and narratives I let my life get run by. And the ones I'm conscious about, I have no problem changing. The thing that I found is that there's these unconscious patterns that I have yet to identify. And the desert metaphorically is where I go to have them present themselves to me. So I can go, oh, I see that. Yeah, let me stop doing that now that I'm conscious of it. And it's visiting the desert becomes purposeful and becomes kind of an interesting thing. And also, I always love to find ways to fill the well creatively. And I do find, sometimes I'll go on these hikes alone, just off into nature. No music, no nothing, just me and nature, and that's it. And that's often when I do have some of my best creative insights. And I think there's this really nice parallel between all that. So I'll throw that out to the world, and if you guys can benefit from that, I hope you do. And it's been an interesting part for me in this talk. So
yeah. It's interesting. We have this language for things these days, because I was just thinking, like, oh yeah, what do we call that when we say it's like, oh yeah, just gonna put the phone away, gonna go for the weekend, gonna disconnect, right, gonna, like, what are some of the other terms, but like we talk about stuff like just like disconnect and da 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 da, but there's just something about when we return to this poetic metaphorical language, and that I think is just so much more creative and captivating than some of our very literal terms for things. And that's actually like a quote that we were working on, that was we're not quite ready to have a conversation about it yet, but there was this quote about metaphorical truths being greater than literal truths, from Ian McGilchrist, which is like, oh, this is loaded, but I haven't quite wrapped my head around it yet. But there's this thing of that metaphor of the desert, that is so much more evocative than just like a disconnect. It's like enter into the desert, incorporate that into your life a little bit more, in just in little ways. But when you enter out into that place, there's stillness and there's silence, and you give the deepest parts of yourself, the soul, which I think in another one of our podcasts, a thought had come to me where it was like, you can think of your soul as if the soul is too much of a, woo-woo term. It's like, well, just think of it as it's the truest part of yourself, or the truest parts of yourself. When you need to have that stillness and silence to give that thing space to be heard, right? Because it's as powerful as a voice you have to really listen for it. You have to really listen for it.
Can I say one thing before you finish?
Sure.
And you have to and this is something I've heard said by many great speakers, is you actually have to learn to hear it.
Yes.
Because it's something that if you never listen to it, you don't even know what it sounds like or feels like, or however you interpret that sensation of it. But as you get closer to it and more intimate with it, it becomes something that you go, oh, you can hear it in even the most distracting areas, but in your early infancy stages, you haven't had chance to really identify it yet.
Well, it's so easy to just head out and just be thinking,
right,
nonstop.
Yeah.
Right. And just thinking and thoughts and stories.
And thoughts that maybe aren't yours.
Yeah, that maybe aren't yours, or just things that are constantly the things that are just on repeat in your head.
Sure.
All the time as it is. And that space of silencing that a little bit more, and there seems to be another kind of voice that starts to come through, a different kind of knowing that starts to come through, and you need to give space to that. We give so much space for this other voice in our lives to come through, and we spend most of our time in life in the modern world giving that the floor, which is, I think, why it's ever more important that we, again, voluntarily enter into that wilderness, enter into that desert space, every week if you can, at least, if some kind of space. Meditation you can even look at as being, that's a voluntary act of entering into the desert.
Totally.
Right? You put stuff away and you just sit.
Yeah.
Just sit with yourself. And the benefits to meditation are pretty well documented at this stage
And
of
yet
point.
you shouldn't meditate just for the benefits.
Yeah.
Because that's part of the trappings of
You enter into it not knowing what
Yes.
you're going to find, not knowing what's going to be there, but you enter into it because there's something waiting for you. Thank you for listening in on our conversation today. We hope you found something helpful that you can carry forward with you. Head over to our website, wayoftheartist.com, for more free exclusive material and learn about the show. If you haven't already, please support us by subscribing to the show, sharing it with people you know, and keeping compassionate, creative conversation going.